Hello and welcome to another episode of Django Chat. In this episode, we're joined by Michael Herman, the founder of Testdriven ILO. I'm Will Vincent, joined as always by Carlton Gibson. Hi, Carlton.
Hello.
And Michael. Hi, Michael.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, happy you could come on. So the title of this episode is going to be From Flask to Django because you've spent a number of years writing production-level Flask code and recently switched over to Django. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that switch and differences you've seen between the two frameworks. But first, can you give a quick background on who you are and how you got into programming?
Sure. I'm a engineer/educator from Denver, Colorado. And yes, I am the founder of Testdriven ILO, which I will talk about in probably just a bit. So my background, I started web development in the late 90s, competing with a friend in Missouri. We were building PlayStation websites and eventually moved on to the LAMP stack and got into hardware during high school. My undergrad years I spent at University of Missouri, started in computer science, moved to philosophy, ended up getting a business degree. After undergrad, moved to New York, got a job at Yahoo, ended up getting transferred out to San Francisco, quit Yahoo, got a master's degree, started working at startups, got into a lot of Python, web scraping, testing, and that's what led me to co-found RealPython with another friend of mine. So RealPython is a...
What's a Python tutorial site, right? Or that's what it was initially when you were involved.
Yeah, so RealPython, I started as like a Kickstarter, basically for teaching practical Python, learning by doing, experiential type learning Python. This was back in 2011. We ended up kickstarting two other courses, a Flask web development course / web fundamentals course, and then a more advanced Django course. And so, again, the philosophy behind it was learning by doing, experiential learning. There was nothing really out there at the time in terms of beginner courses that had that experiential learning philosophy. Mm-hmm. And so, we kickstarted RealPython. I got more into tech education that way, taught full stack JavaScript for a couple of years at a boot camp called Galvanize.
And that was in Denver?
Yeah, that was in Denver.
Yep.
And so after Galvanize, I had to deal with a bunch of imposter syndrome. Can I build anything other than just a basic CRUD app? So I went back into the industry, focused mostly on Flask development, and at the same time started Testdriven.io, which focuses on teaching mid to senior level developers how to build, test, and deploy microservices to AWS.
Wowza, that's a big tale. So what were you using back in the 90s? You said you started off, was that Perl or PHP or what?
GeoCities.
Well, good. Yeah, I trump your PHP.
Just straight HTML and CSS.
Yeah, good. That's
a lot
perfect.
of tables.
Yeah, good.
So so let's talk about Testdriven, because that's built with Django. And maybe, what was that process like? So without, going too deep dive into Flask, I mean, if listeners don't know, it's a micro framework with Python. What kind of struck you? And you'd used Django before, but I think it'd been a couple of years since you'd used it on a large project. Is that right?
Yes.
How did you choose Django, and how did you find that transition to be?
Yeah, so Django, it allowed me to move a lot faster than with Flask. So I wanted to build a full stack web application with server-side templating. And so with all the pieces there that you get from Django out of the box, I was able to move a lot faster with Django over Flask.
Well, you said you'd been doing full stack JavaScript development as well. So you've been using presumably some kind of micro framework in the JavaScript world, like
Express
or Express or...
Right, Express?
Yeah, Node and Express, yeah.
So did you give that a thought to use them, I guess, to get to Carlton's point?
Well, I did have a transition back to Python after Galvanize. So yeah, I did teach full stack JavaScript. I worked on the dev team there, and that was a big Rails app, and they had some microservices and Node and Express that I worked on. But after leaving Galvanize, I worked for a company that was all Flask, and so I got back into Flask that way. So really, the decision for test-driven kind of came down to Flask versus Django for me.
Right, because you're in the Python mindset at that time.
Yeah.
Okay.
So when you started with Django, do you recall, had things changed since you'd last used Django? Because it had been a number of years. Did you have a sense that there had been a bunch of changes like migrations and stuff, or had you used those before you switched over to JavaScript and Flask?
Yeah, not much had changed actually. Yeah, South, the old migration system, was now in the core,
Yep.
Which is nice. But I was already familiar with how the ORM worked and the data models and whatnot, so there wasn't that too many changes. And I think that's really nice with Django. It moves a little bit slower than I would say some other Python frameworks, but because of that, it's much more stable.
Mm-hmm.
Well, like the core ORM operations have been unchanged forever, right? So, if you know how to build a model and you know how to filter and you know how to do those core operations, that's the same from day one to now. And there's all this other stuff that you didn't know about, not that you didn't know about, but there's annotations now, there's search now. And when did that appear?
So given your background in teaching, now that you're fully in the Python world, if someone comes to you and says they want to learn web development, but they haven't worked with a framework before, how do you think about that choice of Flask versus Django, which often comes up for that beginner?
Yeah, it sort of depends on the end goal. I would say, regardless of whether someone's wanting to learn Flask or Django, I generally start, or I recommend that they start with Flask. Flask is just a great tool for learning web development fundamentals in general, like HTTP, routing, that sort of thing. And those things are common, across all web frameworks. So I think also one thing that I often overlook is that the source code for Flask is much smaller. It's much easier to read. And so diving into the source code of Flask is really nice. You can see what's going on underneath the hood.
Yeah. What about for APIs? Are you using an API with Testdriven or not at this stage?
I have a couple endpoints. Yeah, but I wouldn't call it an API.
Have you done? Because I wanted to ask, Flask, especially for how do you build an API endpoint? Flask can do that in a couple lines of code. Yet Django REST framework is very elegant. I just wondered if you had a chance to play around with DRF recently versus doing it kind of raw with Flask.
I have looked at DRF. So one of the courses on the Test-Driven site is a Django course that deals with Django channels, so all the asynchronous fun and Angular on the client side. So I had to kind of dive deep into DRF to really understand what was going on there, especially with the authentication. So
are you, for local development, are you using Docker these days with Test-Driven?
Yes, yeah.
And how do you find that? Because I think you'd been using that at work beforehand, or even you've been using Kubernetes. Is that correct?
Yeah. So yeah, Docker, it just simplifies the development process. There's definitely hurdles in the configuration and 12-factor with settings and whatnot, .m files versus hard coding,
right.
Environment variables in the Docker Compose file. Mm-hmm. But once you sort of figure out how Docker is working and figure out how that you want to get those environment variables inside of your container, then it just makes the process a whole lot easier.
Yeah. And are you, what are you doing for deployment? You've used a host of services that we've talked about offline before.
Yeah, I'm using Heroku. So it feels like 2014.
And are you deploying with containers on Heroku, or you're just doing it like pro-C file way?
So yeah, right now I'm just using Git and the Slug compiler. So I am in the process of moving everything over to the Docker deployments, but right now I'm just sticking with the Slug compiler.
And then, so why did you make that choice? Because clearly you know how to set up server and do it, on a VPS if you wanted to. How did you think about that choice of using Heroku or, a platform as a service as opposed to infrastructure as a service, given that you have experience with both?
Well, Heroku gives you everything out of the box. It gives you logging and monitoring. You can set up cron-like jobs, all these different services that I would have to set up and manage and upgrade and maintain on my own. Heroku just does that all for me. So I can just pass it Django and Green Unicorn or whatever, and then set up all those different extensions, and I'm good to go.
Yeah,
that's the saving, right? It's all very well maintaining, I don't know, your cron file, your cron tab file, but that's not the most fun in the world.
No.
And it doesn't take long per se, but there's that job, and then there's the other job, and then there's the other job, and then there's the other job, and all those add up to more than your Heroku build.
So what was the process for, prototyping and then building, and I know you're still working on Testdriven. Can you talk about how you sort of prioritize features and, again, because I think this is a trap sometimes when you go from working in a production environment, it's easy to want to over-optimize everything because you're just familiar with it. But there still needs to be some sort of process to getting to this optimized point across the board, and maybe we can talk about some of the optimizations on Django's site. But do you recall kind of what was the MVP and then how you layered on complexity? Because I think you initially had a Jekyll site before, so you weren't starting from scratch with the test-driven domain, right? You knew you were going to have traffic.
Sure. So yeah, I did start with a Jekyll site, just a static site generator, and was selling the course as just a PDF. And I wanted to move to more of like an interactive, web application where the end users, instead of downloading a PDF and then, never coming back again, always have to come to the website and log in and go through the website. It's more interactive for them, and it's also customers will continue to come back and I can upsell them and whatnot. So yeah, I basically wanted to port over the main functionality from Jekyll, and then from there needed to add on authentication, authorization, and then some sort of payment provider to handle payments.
And then what are you using for the payment provider?
So I'm using Stripe for that.
And had you thought about, because I get these days, it's Braintree as well, I think, and Stripe are the two. Was there another one you considered at all, or was just Stripe the one you thought you'd go with?
Yeah, so there's Stripe, there's Braintree, there's a number of different startups that have been built on top of Stripe.
Right.
So I was thinking of sort of abstracting that out. So I did initially start with one of those, Gumroad, and I was using that when I was just selling the PDF. But now that I'm not selling a digital download anymore, I moved away from Gumroad.
Got it. And then for email, because you must have both transaction and potentially marketing emails, did you set up any async process for that, or maybe you could talk through how you set that up in a Django context?
Yeah, so I do have transactional emails for password or email confirmation, and then also for other sorts of things. So yeah, I'm using Django RQ, the extension for Redis queue, and so to get the process out of the request response handler, just puts the job into the queue, and then have a separate process constantly looking at the queue. Is there a job? If there's a job, it grabs the job and then sends it to SendGrid, and then SendGrid will send out the transactional email.
Got it. Carlton, I've dominated the discussion. Are there any questions that come to mind for you?
Yeah, just on the queue choice. I mean, so the big beast in the room is Celery, right? And I'm just wondering why you chose RQ over Celery. I mean, I've got my own views there, but it'd be interesting to see what you've got to say.
I've used RQ pretty extensively the past 3 or 4 years, and I was just familiar with it. I haven't touched Celery in a little while.
Yeah.
I didn't really need all of the robust scheduling and retrying that I know that you get from Celery. So it was just basically sending transactional emails. I have a couple other things that I'm using the queue for, but yeah, I mean, just from a functionality standpoint, I didn't need everything that Celery gave me.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, brilliant.
And what about, again, because I think this is a great chance for listeners to go through the list of, building out from scratch a a Django site, with the knowledge that you have, was there, testing? So how did you find, I guess, doing tests with Django? Because it'd been a little while, and then are you using any additional services as well to test your application?
Yeah, the testing pyramid has really changed for me the past few years. So testing pyramid, most of your tests are going to be unit tests, and you have some functional tests, and then at the very top of the pyramid, you do a bit of end-to-end or browser-based testing. So a testing tool came out a few years ago called Cypress, and that's for browser-based testing. And so it's really actually good for testing out asynchronous type single page applications. So I would say Selenium is great for server-side templating type applications and page refreshes. It doesn't handle all the asynchronous type stuff really well. Cypress handles that really well. So what you get out of the box with Cypress is basically end-to-end tests or browser-based tests that are a whole lot less finicky and a lot easier to write. And so because of that, the testing pyramid is, for me, I write mostly browser-based tests and unit tests. I kind of steer clear of like a lot of the functional tests at this point.
Interesting.
So what would you call a functional test in that context then? Because, obviously like running a browser automation, that's obvious. And then unit tests, you're probably, testing individual bits of logic. Then what would you call a functional test and how would you run that?
Yeah, I guess a functional test probably what I'm meaning more is like integration tests.
Okay.
So like, just if you have to hit a database or you have to test like multiple functions or multiple views or whatnot.
Various components working together.
Yeah.
So related to testing, I assume you're using some form of continuous integration as well?
Yeah, so I'm using Semaphore CI for that.
And then why did you choose them, I guess?
Is that a hosted service? Is that?
Yeah, it's a host solution,
okay.
Yeah.
Because there's these days there's Semaphore, there's Travis, there's Circle. I think GitHub has their own one in beta. Maybe GitLab has their own. What was it about Semaphore that stood out to you?
I'm not sure. I don't remember.
Other than you have to pick one, and
Right.
But are you using it just you're using it for deployment as well, right? Not just. Can you talk about just the pipeline of incorporating it, I guess, in the project?
Yeah, so I am using it for both CI and CD, so continuous integration, continuous delivery / deployment. Yeah, I guess in terms of the reason why I picked that is the way that I'm running my Cypress tests in the CI environment. So I'm not running the Cypress tests inside the Docker container. I'm running the Cypress tests outside the Docker container, and they're testing against the Docker container or the web application that's running inside the Docker container. So for whatever reason, I couldn't get that to work exactly right on Travis Circle, and I could get it to work on Semaphore. I have been meaning to maybe switch over to GitLab just because I like having the source code and CI/CD and whatnot built into GitLab, and GitLab has vaults for secrets as well. So I like that one-stop shop type platform. Mm-hmm. So eventually I'll probably move over to GitLab, but for right now Semaphore is just working for me, and so there's not really a reason to switch.
No, and once you got one of these things going, it's really easy just to keep it going, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And then are you doing so local production, are you using a staging server as well?
Yeah, I do have a staging environment, yeah.
And then just for maybe, and since you're a former educator, for listeners who aren't familiar with that flow, could you talk about why you would set up a staging server and how that flow plays out? So you do a local change, and then then what happens before it gets to the live site?
Sure. So I do a form of like the feature branch workflow, sort of like a Git flow type approach. And so, I create a new feature branch. I make some changes locally. I test it out locally. I do a commit, push it up to GitHub. That'll trigger Semaphore. Semaphore then run CI. And if it's on if it's running against just a feature branch, it won't actually do any sort of deployments to staging or prod. But as soon as I do a merge request, another
merge to master.
merge to develop, another build will kick off. And then as soon as I merge that into develop, that's when another build will kick off. And as long as that passes, then it'll deploy to the staging environment. So the reason why I do that is because I just want a place to be able to test it out on Heroku, and just to make sure that what's happening on my development environment locally is the same as or as close to what it will be when it's in production.
Right. And then, so then do you manually go and check before committing to production from staging, or how do you make that leap?
I'll do some like manual tests. I mean, everything's really covered by Cypress at that point, so I don't really need to worry about it too much. But I'll just do like one last visual check, or if it's a blog post or something like that, I'll send the link to the blog post author, and they can take a look at it before it goes live. So just little things like that. I like to be able to view it before it goes live.
Right. And so are you? You mentioned authors. So Testdriven's what started with just you, right? But now, what's kind of the master plan, right? Because I know you have another course on there, and you're adding blog posts by other contributors as well?
Yeah, so Testdriven is starting to scale. I am starting to bring on more content creators, so whether that's tutorial authors or course producers. So the other course on there right now is written by a friend of mine, Jason Parent. He is writing another course right now. It's basically the current Django channels course with React instead of Angular. I'm breaking up the large monolithic course, the microservices course myself right now. So that's going to be like 4 or 5 different courses, hopefully by the end of the summer. Onboarding a couple other course producers right now as well. So just looking to scale that out. I'm doing some design work right now with some other companies, and yeah, hopefully the platform will have a couple more courses and have a nice makeover by the end of the summer.
Sounds all go.
And then are you still going to stick, do you think, to the per course pattern, or how do you, as a content creator, how do you think about, because I think about this obviously all the time as well, subscription versus kind of pay as you go, given that you're now building out a platform?
Haven't really thought too much about that. Probably just continue to do this pay as you go. Setting up subscriptions, that's going to be a lot of development work. So yeah, I'd say if I wanted to go that route, it'd probably be 3 to 6 months worth of development to change that workflow.
Oh wow, okay.
Well, also I'm not working on Testdriven full time, and that's part of the reason why that would take a long time.
Got it. I guess so. I think there's maybe a couple more things just on the stack itself. Again, because I think this is such a great chance to look at a newly built stack. What are you using for, I don't know, for DNS? Are you using Heroku or using something special to handle DNS?
So it's a combination of, it's actually Frankenstein together. I hate DNS. So it's a combination of DreamHost, Cloudflare, Heroku, and Netlify was in there for a bit. And I got Netlify out of there, so I'm using Cloudflare, Heroku, and DreamHost.
This is just for resolving your host name, right?
Yes.
Right. Wow. Okay.
Well, so why do you have 3? Like, what was not working that caused you to add these all in, right? Because if I'm a new developer and I read, one of your tutorials or Django for beginners, I can put a site up with SSL on Heroku, problem solved. Like, what's not solved when you're actually at a production level?
Because I bought the domain name through a different company, and then started out with Netlify deploys, and then went to Netlify DNS, and then wanted to move to Heroku. And so I transferred the domain name once and screwed up DNS for about 6 hours, transferred it back. It was, I don't know if you want to go down this route, but it was definitely a nightmare.
Yeah. No, just at a high level, I think it's just.
But when DNS goes wrong, it really goes wrong, right?
Yeah.
Fair enough. Well, speaking of so monitoring, right? Are you using any sort of app-specific monitoring or uptime monitoring? Because there's a whole suite of tools for that. Are you using any of those as well?
Yeah, for uptime monitoring, I don't remember. I'm using the Uptime Robot or something like that. the platform doesn't really go down at this point, so which has been nice. I think I've gotten like one email in the past like 6 months about the site like going down, but it was immediately back up, so it might have been a false negative. But
or Heroku, something or other.
Yeah. So yeah, Uptime Robot, using a combination of New Relic, Sentry, and log entries, and all that comes from the Heroku add-on, Heroku add-ons, and then Postgres and Redis.
Yeah. So are you doing some kind of APM, application performance monitoring?
Yeah, I'm using like New Relic.
Right. Okay.
I guess New Relic is handling that. Yeah.
And that gives you a breakdown of request time, where it's spent in different parts of your code and things like that.
Oh, actually, Heroku gives you a lot of that information.
Does it? Interesting.
The straight Heroku dashboard will give you a number of nice key metrics like that.
For logging, because we're meaning to do an episode on logging on the podcast. We haven't yet. What, how deep are your logs? What sort of stuff are you logging, right? Because this is sort of an extra step on top of your tests. Or can you talk through how you thought about logging in terms of building out the Django side?
Yeah, whenever I'm doing a try except or try catch, that's generally I'm throwing the logger in there. Certain things like transactions in terms of Stripe payments, I'm throwing the logger in there. Let's see where else. It's kind of, I haven't really thought too much about that, and that's definitely something. There's a backlog for tickets to clean up the logger. Going back to the application performance monitoring, I'm using Scout for that. That just hit me. So that's another add-on that you get from Heroku. And Sentry is used for like the exception monitoring. So that's anytime an error is thrown and it bubbles up, then Sentry will catch that and send me emails and whatnot.
Yeah. So it's quite a lot of, just for, listeners to get a sense of all these tools, for on the spectrum, a relatively straightforward application, you're using, well over a dozen tools, third-party tools, right? Either free or paid, to help you monitor and process just pretty standard web app flows, emails, and all the rest.
Yeah, and I am on the free tiers for all those monitoring services. They come out of the box with Heroku, and so yeah, Heroku just allows me to be able to just focus on my application and not have to worry about infrastructure at all. I would say Heroku gets expensive quick, but I'm a single person development team. I'm not going to hire a DevOps person anytime soon, so I'm happy to pay whatever they tell me.
Yeah, that's the great question, right? That's because what's your hourly rate? How much would it cost you to hire a developer to do these things? How much do you save? And these platforms of the services, the you do the sums, well, that's quite expensive, but all the things you don't have to do, well, what did you save? And we talked to Tom Dyson, and he made the comment that these from Wagtail Torchbox, Wagtail fame, and he made the point that if you really do the maths and you include the developer time, you can scale these things quite a long way before they become uneconomical.
And I believe Torchbox, which major agency, they use Heroku for most of their client work, actually.
Yeah, for exactly these reasons, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the reasons why Python came into existence, was like to optimize for the developer time.
Yeah, exactly. So there was one other thing I've noticed on your site. You have for search. This is relevant because by the time this episode comes out, it will be announced that I'm giving a talk at Django Khan on search. Can you talk about how you went through that process of search? And because search is such a deep field, and you've got a nice search implementation. How did you go about that?
I think from the end user perspective, it may look nice, but it's very, very janky in the code. So I'm not doing anything fancy in there. And actually, I haven't looked at that code in like 3 or 4 months. So
for me, it's kind of interesting because, there's this kind of pressure. Oh, you've got to have Elasticsearch or whatever. You don't have to have Elasticsearch a lot of the time. You can do it with your database. And for a lot of sites, that's actually good enough.
Yeah, I'm really just doing straight filters on like the content itself. And so I guess it is doing a very janky flavor of full text search, but I'm not taking any advantage of any of like the full text full text search features that you get from either Django or Postgres.
Right. Okay. Interesting.
Got it.
And yet, from the end user perspective, it's quite effective.
Yeah, it works fine as just an end user. No complaints.
It's a very, very basic search. I have complaints about it, but then again, I'm a bit close to it. But it's just a very, very basic search. There's not really any ordering to it. So if you search for Docker, and really it's just going to like sort that based on like the date. So there might be a blog post with 15 instances of Docker. There might be a blog post that comes after that has one hit for Docker, and it's going to sort that based on the date. So it's not even like concerned about how many different instances of Docker showing up. So it's a very, very naive search.
Okay, but if it's good enough for the size of the content that you've got, and it serves for the users, then that's enough. I think this is really interesting, just because it's a problem that we see all the time in technology. We're always tempted to gold plate it. We're tempted to do the thing which is the absolute best engineering standards, when it's a lot of times it's not needed.
Yeah, given an unlimited amount of time, I would definitely focus on it. And I do get a lot of emails, people asking not directly about search, but indirectly, in the sense of like, do you talk about this in the course, or do you talk about that, or where do you mention blah, blah, blah. And in my head, I'm like, well, use the search. And then I'm like, well, the search isn't all that great, so maybe I shouldn't tell them that.
Okay.
Yeah. That is nice, I guess, versus I guess you can search a PDF as well. I was going to say you can point them to search, and they can, if they have the course, they can search through and find it. Though I guess if they haven't purchased the course, they only get the first couple parts or chapters. They don't get the full thing. So that would probably be why they would ask you that question.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So something else you're involved in, which we haven't mentioned yet, is your conferences. I mean, you speak a lot, but then also Pi Colorado is coming up this fall, which you're involved with. Do you want to speak about that at all?
Yeah. So Pi Colorado is early September. So that's September 6th, 7th, and 8th. The main conference is going to be the 7th and 8th. That's Saturday and Sunday. And then there's a workshop day that's similar to the PyCon workshops. That's going to be on Friday the 6th. So I'm the program chair. So I am organizing all of the talks, all of the speakers, and all of the workshops.
Wow. Well, that's quite a bit of work.
Yeah. And so the next weekend, I'm actually getting married. And so I'm kind of, September is going to be a little crazy for me.
Yeah. And do you know, are you going to be able to attend Django Khan, which I think is later that month?
I don't know. Depends on what things look like, maybe mid-September.
Yeah.
I'm probably not going to make a decision on that for a while.
So we've talked a lot about Django. Maybe just to circle back to what we started with, you've worked with so many different frameworks. You've mentioned Flask, Rails, Express. How do you think of, which one to choose? Like, what are some cases where, Flask is very well suited to something versus Rails or maybe Express? Are there some examples that come to mind where you would pick a specific framework for a specific task? Or would you start with a language?
Yeah, I would start with definitely the language and figure out, which language you're going to be coding in. Because if you're coding Ruby, you're probably not going to want to use Django. But I'm not sure how to answer that question. But some of the use cases that I look for in terms of Flask versus Django, I look at project size. I look at the type of application. I also look at the size of the team. I'd say the application type is a big one. So, a website versus a web app versus a web service. And I know that not everything is cleanly bucketed, into those three different things. But let's say a website is just static generated. A web app is a full stack web application. It could be single page application. It could be something server side templating, and a web service could be just a basic RESTful API. So I like to think in terms of those buckets. And so if it's a website that's just static generated, probably not going to use Django for that. So if it's a web app, Django is great for that. I think the Jam stack over the past couple of years, the JavaScript APIs markup, sort of the Netlify stack, the serverless type stack. is kind of eating away into sort of Django's dominance as a web application framework. And then sort of a web service, I like to use either Django or Flask for that.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time playing with static site generators and even Jamstack types of things, and found myself constantly coming back to Django. Why? Because every time I was like, oh, well, now I need a web form. And now I know Netlify does this kind of thing now, but it's like, oh, now I need a web form. Or now I need auth. And it was like always the case where I'd saved myself a little bit of time setting up my Django app and writing my first template view by just slapping up a HTML page. But then I had to go and retrofit it all every time. And it was like, do you know what? I give up on that. And I found myself more and more just like, I'm not going to experiment with this static site generator for this project because it's just going to cost me time in the medium term.
Well, partly that's also given that you know Django so well. Once you know any tool, whatever framework it is, you can kind of make it do what you want. And then do you need to relearn the wheel?
No, exactly. And using like, an alternative micro framework, it's always more time for me digging in the docs to learn the other API than it is to just use Django. But again, I guess that's familiarity.
Yeah, I mean that's a good point. I don't think it's ever a good time when you're working on a project to experiment with something new. Just go with what you're familiar with. It's easy. It's a lot easier to estimate how long it's going to take to complete something.
Yeah, and that's simple.
Maybe dabble here and there in some with some toy projects outside like a project that you're doing for work or freelance or whatever. But that's a good time when to like spin up like, hey, how can I actually recreate like this full Django web application using Netlify or Flask and
right.
and serverless and whatnot. So
and it's always worth giving every new framework a run and seeing what it does and seeing the way it approaches things, because it makes you a better developer overall because you know different approaches and different styles and
exactly.
Well, so maybe as a concluding point, the title of your course is Microservices with Flask, React, Docker. How do you think about microservices? When do you? Because I know you've worked with those professionally, but in terms of for your own, for Testdriven, did you think about a microservices approach, or where do you? How do you think about microservices? Just to give you a broad question. When are they appropriate? Like, what do they? What problems do they solve, and what problems do they cause? Because they're typically used in larger companies. You don't necessarily usually see a startup go with microservices.
Yeah, I mean, to relate that back to Django and Flask, the 2018 JetBrains Python developer survey when that came out, Flask was actually slightly ahead in terms of popularity than Django, and I don't know if that's just because that's JetBrains users in general, but I would say that's more of the web development industry and the trend toward the smaller frameworks, the microservices, and the serverless platforms the past 4 or 5 years or so. And I guess going back directly to your question, microservices, I mean, they can be good. They're not like going to fix like if you have a lot of problems in your company, if your development teams are very siloed, it's not going to fix that by any means. Mm-hmm. You definitely need to address some of those softer skills first, but microservices can help. It can help scale certain pieces of your application that get a lot of traffic. It can help with isolating bits and pieces of your application to decouple it from other processes and whatnot, so that it can run independently. It can be scaled independently. So I know microservices is it's obviously a trend these days, and there's a lot of questions about it and how to go about it, and micro front end frameworks or whatever has been a trend on Twitter the past week, and that seems bonkers to me. But maybe next year this time I'll be talking more about micro front end frameworks, or whatever people are called micro front ends, I think is the term. It's sort of the.
Go on, carry on.
Go ahead. Sorry, I was going to say, so the problems that you have with micro front ends is, and the same with microservices, micro backends or whatever, is that the core state So how are you maintaining state across those applications if you need to? And ideal world, you wouldn't have to do that. You could be able to scale and deploy all those things, and you wouldn't have to worry about shared state. But there's going to be a certain amount of shared state, and that's a huge problem.
Well, and I think you had said at some point, Michael, that you thought one of the things about microservices is that it shifted the complexity away from the individual developer kind of up a level to the I guess the SRE, the site reliability engineer. Do you recall saying that? Is that something you want to expand on? Because I thought,
yeah, you can quote me on that.
Well, it struck me when you mentioned that, because it did seem like you do have this issue of, if it doesn't necessarily solve the problem, but it moves it from the hands of an individual engineer who may have, who knows how many years of experience they have. Maybe it kicks it up in a large site where you do have entire teams around site reliability and deployment, and they can maybe are forced to handle some of those issues rather than giving that power to an individual engineer who can do something silly in a monolithic framework setting.
Yeah, I mean, smaller code bases are easier to work with.
Yeah.
And so if you break apart your monolith into smaller code bases, you're going to have, in theory, you're going to have less bugs. You're going to be able to move faster. Product likes that. Developers like working on things like that. But then the problem is function calls now become network calls. And so you have to deal with that at the infrastructure level. So you're shifting that complexity away from the individual developers more towards the DevOps, the sysadmin, the SRE team.
Well, so as we come to the end here, we've talked a lot about how you built Testdriven with Django and your thoughts on Flask. Do you have any concluding thoughts on, developers looking at, Flask or Django and how to think about that choice?
Yeah, I think that you really need to look at sort of the application type versus time, the amount of time you have to develop something. And there's going to obviously be some trade-offs there. Think about what you can absolutely not compromise on, and then base your decision on that. And based on that, sometimes you'll choose Django, other times you'll choose Flask, and that doesn't make one better than the other. I mean, they're really used to achieve the same things, building web applications. They just have very different approaches, or the means are different.
Yeah, exactly. And goal of this podcast is not to just relentlessly beat the drum on Django, but to try to be honest and open about its strengths and why people choose other things, and just let people have that choice, but at the same time not fall into the trap that I think a lot of beginners see experienced developers do, which is just to say it depends all the time. So I appreciate that you've been, sort of backed up the choices you've made and building out Testdriven, because ultimately a choice has to be made. Many choices, even for a basic website.
Yeah, like you got to choose your database, you got to choose your web server, you've got to choose your hosting, you've got to choose you got to choose your language, you've got to.
Anyway, at some level, it just becomes, you just choose what you're used to, as we've mentioned before. But it's also worth knowing what else is out there, and also having, if someone says, "Why did you use XYZ?" say, "Oh, well, sometimes it's good to reevaluate your decisions, because things, frameworks do change, new features are added." But hopefully Django will just stay mature and just keep getting more and more awesome.
Yeah, and Django definitely decreases the amount of decisions you have to make. Same with Heroku.
Yes.
Yeah, any opinionated thing, it gives you some guide rails, and gives you rails. So
yeah, and especially as you mentioned, when you're a solo developer in a small team, you don't have the luxury of making all those little decisions. So thank you so much for joining us. If listeners want to reach out to you, what's the best way, Michael?
So Twitter is probably the best way, at Mike Herman. You can also reach me via email at michael@testdriven.io.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time, and it's been really educational to hear how you've built out Testdriven with Django.
Yeah, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, much appreciated. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.